Hi, everyone. My name is Jessie Fairbanks. I'm a features programmer at Doc NYC, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to a Q&A with the director, Nathalie Bibeau, who is the director of The Walrus and The Whistleblower. Please welcome Nathalie. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing The Walrus and The Whistleblower with Doc NYC's audience.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So let's dive right in. This is such an incredible, exciting, energetic, poignant film about one man and his crusade for his beloved walrus, but there are so many other larger story arcs going on with regards to marine land and animals in captivity and the commodification of wild things for our entertainment. Let's start with Phil Demers, this larger than life character who is the main subject of the film. I am assuming, since you are from the area, that he was on your radar before you started to make this film. But let's start with the beginning. What was it about Phil and his crusade to save Smooshy that drew you in and propelled you to making this story?
Well, it was the eccentricity of it. I mean, I had never heard of a guy who was trying to save a walrus. And I actually knew Phil when we were kids. So we grew up in the same small town. We were both Franco-Ontarians, part of this minority there. And he was friends with my brother. So I didn't know him very well, but I had an idea of the image he was projecting at the time as a kid growing up. And it was basically one of a troublemaker who really didn't care about too much at all, except living this sort of small town life. And then I left that small town and lived in various countries around the world and eventually settled in Toronto and then in Montreal. And while I was doing that, he went and got a job at Marineland because he wasn't sure what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. And so he's 22 years old and he gets this job there and he loves it because he loves animals and he thinks, oh, I found my dream job. This is amazing. And, over the years, of course, Smooshy comes into his life. He falls in love with her. She falls in love with him. And the media get a hold of this and they go crazy for it. And so I'm already working in film by the time this story sort of pops up. But I hadn't seen Phil in years and I was just watching it from a distance thinking, that's whack. But it didn't quite make a film yet because it was just this fluffy story. And then 5 years later, of course, he comes out as a whistleblower with allegations of animal abuse and a very different story. So he goes from being a poster child for the industry of captivity to a poster child against it. And then I start to think, oof, there's an arc here. There's something interesting, but I don't do anything about it because, it was a torturous process. It's like when I look at it in hindsight now, actually, I can see myself in 2012, 13, and 14, knowing intuitively that one day I would make this film, and yet waiting until I felt I had the courage to do it, both because Marineland was frightening, this idea they were suing a lot of people, they were suing Phil, they were suing his girlfriend, other whistleblowers, activists, and the media, some very powerful and well-regarded media outlets in Canada were being sued. I didn't know if I wanted to kind of get back in touch with Phil and make a film about someone I knew. I thought that was a bit dicey. All this to say, it grows inside of me, and no one in the meantime is making a film about it. And I'm thinking, how is this possible? And I realized, oh, the film's waiting for me. Oh, I see. It's like, this is actually my film and I need to grab it. So that's how it happened.
It's a wonderful story. Thank you so much for sharing. And I absolutely agree. The film was waiting for you. I have so much that I want to ask you about the film and about the filmmaking process, but I know that the first question on all of our audience mind is going to be, how is Smooshy? Can you give us an update on her well-being?
Well, that is the million-dollar question because we don't know. 4 days after this film first premiered in Canada, Smooshy gave birth to a calf, which shocked the world, shocked Phil, shocked me. We didn't know she was pregnant. Walruses are pregnant for a long time. They have a long gestational period. So Marineland is claiming that she was impregnated by the last walrus that was there before, that died basically, the last walrus to die at Marineland, a walrus named Apollo. They're insinuating that in their press release. There are other speculations that she was inseminated by a German facility that is known to be adept at that kind of thing. Walrus births are very dangerous in captivity. They're rare, and we know nothing since. We've heard nothing since. So this press release went out in June, early June, saying Smooshy's given birth to her first calf. There was a picture of the calf, and that's it. And now months of silence. So it's a bit destabilizing, particularly for Phil, because of the nature of walrus births, being so dangerous, and the silence on top of that. With COVID as well, access to performances are not the same at Marineland. They're not allowed to do them anymore. The park opened late as well. It would normally open in May. It only opened in July. So there haven't really been a lot of eyes on the animals there. And so we're all waiting to see, is the baby okay? Is Smooshy okay? Are they still there? We don't know.
That's just so shocking, especially when you consider that any kind of organization that traffics in presenting wildlife to audiences tend to capitalize on babies, especially those born in captivity. They're a huge draw, a massive moneymaker.
Absolutely. And you're right on about that, because, the first walrus birth in captivity in Canada was in 2016, which is very recent. And so you would think that they would want to celebrate this and say, wow, this was a huge feat. Look how healthy Smooshy is. She was so healthy, she gave birth, and this is magnificent, and come see a baby walrus. And not that we're aware of. So why?
Oh, that's so troubling. Thank you for updating us. And I'm sure that we're all now more worried about Smooshy than ever, and sending her all of our well wishes. God, what a journey this lovely lady has been on. Well, thank you for sharing that update. The other update I'm sure that everyone else is eager to hear is about the animals that were grandfathered in under the ban of cessations in captivity. The grandfathered clause meant that any cessation who was already in captivity could remain in captivity, but no new animals could be brought into captivity. And cessations include dolphins and whales, but do not include walruses or seals or the beluga whale, or do they?
They include belugas, yeah. So cetaceans are orca, beluga, and dolphins in the case of Marineland. And then the pinnipeds are walruses, seals, and sea lions.
Do we know how the other animals who've been grandfathered in and who remain in captivity in Marineland are doing?
Well, we know that there are over 50 belugas in captivity at Marineland, which is the largest population in captivity of belugas in the world. There are more belugas there than there are in the entire United States in captivity. And so this is really the industry's future, because now that the public opinion has really shifted on the captivity of these whales, but even more so on the capture of wild whales, what the industry is relying on is breeding. And so the law in Canada that has just banned the captivity of whales and dolphins also bans breeding, which means that the generation of whales at Marineland is the last generation of their kind, at least in this country. There is a fairly important story developing right now where there are institutions in the US who are trying to bring in some of Marineland's whales because they want to study them, and they say they want to ensure the diversity of the populations in the US to be able to continue captivity there, because it's not illegal there. So Marineland's whales are in the middle of a fairly high stakes game in the industry of captivity and zoos and aquariums. We don't know much about their welfare, how they're doing. I mean, there are births, there are deaths. Those statistics are reviewed by animal welfare activists. But with the law now, they can't perform anymore. So they're basically just there to live out their days and or potentially being transferred out to the US if Marineland is able to get through the red tape here. And then the singular orca who's there, Kiska, she's been there 40 years. She's been alone for 7 or 8 of those years. She's had 5 babies, all are dead. And she's there, she's just alone there. That's what we know about her. And then of course there are the dolphins, fewer of them, but status quo really. The hope I think for activists is really that those individuals are there and they'll continue to live their lives there, with perhaps a little bit of movement to the US if that works out for them. But ultimately this is the end of an era. You know, this is what we as a Canadian society have decided, is that we're no longer going to accept this to continue in the future. So my kids and their kids won't have this as an entertainment, let's say, in the future.
It's so bittersweet because on the one hand, it's such progressive legislation, and yet there are so many animals that will, as you say, continue to live out their life in solidarity in enclosures, which is deeply troubling and saddening, and kind of takes the wind out of some of the massive wins that have been made in the legislative arena.
Guys, if I can add just a very quick point, actually, I forgot to mention that in Canada, they're trying to build a whale sanctuary off the east coast of Nova Scotia. And I followed that story as well. It's not in the film. It'll be in a digital extra that I'm preparing, but they're hoping to actually convince Marineland to give them 5 to 8 belugas to rehabilitate them in the seaside sanctuary and potentially release a few of those individuals if they deem them to be ready. So there is a little bit of hope there. There's some movement forward in terms of what might happen.
Thank you for sharing that. Obviously, there's so much to talk about. We haven't even touched on how Phil is doing. First, I'd like to ask you about the film itself. You know, it covers so much ground. We follow Phil for years. You use a lot of archive images to show his work at Marineland and his previous activism work before you started, you know, ramping up the film project, and his crusade to free Smooshie. It's so beautifully told, but it's such an intense undertaking because you're exploring, as we say, the commodification of animals for entertainment, looking at this deeply personal story between a man and a walrus. You're also looking at the politics and the business that, you know, are interplay here, that affect the lives of all of these individuals. And so there's just so many layers to this film. How did you find your stride as a storyteller in putting together a film that pulls in so many tendrils?
It was a long and arduous process. It was a difficult edit because initially, you know, when I started to follow this particular story, I was also following other narrative strands, you know, wild captures in Russia, the Sanctuary Project, you know, the Blackfish folks, what are they up to now? You know, like all of that stuff, because it's a huge domain. And the more the edit was going on, you know, I was screening the footage. I realized how rare this particular story is with Phil and Smooshie. And so I eventually decided to make that really the strong thread, because it's not something anyone else was going to have access to. And then the other narrative strands, instead of exploring them in great detail, I would just touch on them to be as touchstones, to be able to come out to the universal. And to also make the point that this molecular story of Phil and Smooshie is a universal tale, actually, not just about our love of animals and our commitment to them, but also about the nature of change, the resistance to change, human hubris on both sides, Phil included. That's involved in a fight, right? So the conflicts, the hills we're willing to die on, what we're willing to do to vindicate our truths, freedom of expression, these kinds of larger themes, I realized I could touch on by really focusing on this Niagara Falls story. So, you know, that great saying where the more specific you are, the more universal you end up. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what I decided to do in the end, after a process of many cards, colored cards on the wall, shifting them around late in the evening over and over and over again. And then finally taking whole narrative strands and throwing them out the door, just like, okay, can't do it, can't do that, can't do, and then really whittling it down to its core. And then trying to have those visual metaphors that we're coming into to cue people visually that we're dealing with a human story as well as an animal story.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, the film is such a wild ride. You do such an incredible job of synthesizing all of these different concepts into a very personal story. And ultimately, it's a very hopeful story of redemption and of change, even if that is incremental. I wanted to talk to you about so many other things with the film, but we're out of time. So the last question that I'd like to ask you is, given how hard you've worked on this film, how hard Phil has worked to free Smooshy, the ongoing kind of engagement that there is, as you say, there are follow-up stories to this that you're going to build as extras to the film. What is the one action point or takeaway that you hope everyone walks away with after watching The Walrus and the Whistleblower?
I think it is, from an action point standpoint, I would say to think long and hard before you engage with the industry. And that doesn't mean don't go, because I'm not a proponent of ignoring something or not investigating something yourself. I think everyone should be able to make their own decisions on these things. But bigger than that for me, because it isn't an activist film, it's really a film that's inspired by humanity and story and all of these themes that we've been talking about, that I would love for people to have introspection on their own relationship with animals, where they are on the spectrum. Phil being an ardent anti-captivity activist, but a meat eater, is an interesting question that I raised in the film for people just to think about when it comes to their own relationship with food and with the planet, but also their relationship with other people. When we all dig our heels in and we all have a tendency to just get into when we really believe in something. And I guess that discussion around how far would you go, for something you love.
What an incredibly powerful note to end on. Nathalie, thank you so much. I'm so glad that the film waited for you to be made and that you accepted you stepped up and you accepted the challenge. It's a beautiful film. We're so happy to have it here. I know that the audience probably has tons of questions about Phil, who's very active on social media, so people can go get updates about him there. But I just really appreciate you sharing Smooshy's story, the plight of animals at Marineland, and putting forward such thought-provoking concepts. So ladies and gentlemen at home, please put your hands together for Nathalie Bibeau, the director of The Walrus and the Whistleblower. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your film with Doc NYC.
Thank you.